Hi everyone, and welcome to Free to Be You and Read. It's so nice to see all of you here, and a big welcome to our audience tuning in at home. I am Jennifer Schwartz, Programming Services Manager for the Harris County Public Library, and I'm so thrilled to be partnering with the Rice Humanities Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality on tonight's event. I want to thank the center with a special thanks to Associate Director Brian Riedel and postdoctoral fellow, Tesla Cariani, who was kind enough to be moderating our panel tonight. Thank you very much. As I mentioned, we're also streaming this event from home. We're going to have time for a Q&A session after the event. If you're watching from home, just put those questions in the chat and we will answer them as we are able. So I think, and please, if you're viewing from home, put comments in the chat. Let us know what you think. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cariani. Thank you. And thanks to our wonderful panel who you'll meet in a moment. We're so honored to have them here. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, everyone. Great. So thank you first to Jennifer for asking me to moderate this panel. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of kind of the structure of our event, and then we'll jump in. So in the middle here, we have Leigh Pfeffer, who's the host of the podcast History is Gay, and Leigh's pronouns are they, them. Next, we have Aubree Calvin, host of the podcast Southern Queeries, and Aubree's pronouns are she, her. And then last, but certainly not least, we're joined by MC Brickell, the Library Services Specialist at the Katy Branch Library. MC's pronouns are she, her, and we all have MC to thank for organizing this panel. So I'm going to let MC talk a little bit about how everything came together.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's really great to see so many people in person, and I'm sure to the streaming audience who I know of, a bunch of my overseas friends are staying up past their bedtime to watch. I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit briefly about how this event came to be. So I've been with Harris County Public Library for 6 years, and over those 6 years, I've kind of gone from creating LGBTQ book displays to putting on LGBTQ events during the month of June. I've worked with local groups to kind of bring them into the Katy Branch Library and just, let the community know that we're there and we're there to support them. But it always had been just my branch, just very localized. So even though the support was there in the whole system, I wanted to let the community know that all of Harris County Public Library was behind them. And so I got to thinking, just what could I do this year to be a little bit more gay? Yeah, and so another librarian in the system, Rachel Moore, actually put me in contact with Leigh, the podcast host of History is Gay. I sent off an introductory email, and from there, it just kind of spiraled into what you'll see today. And I'm just really excited to be here and get to talk about Texas LGBT history and book censorship.
Awesome. Okay, so for the flow this evening, Leigh and Aubree are going to kick us off with a short presentation on Texas LGBTQ plus history, and then they're going to be followed by a discussion about book banning and censorship by MC, and then I'm going to moderate a bit of a discussion between the panel before opening it up to an audience Q&A. So please take away Leigh and Aubree.
Yeah, hi everybody, welcome. It's really wonderful to see so many faces here, and I'm really grateful to everybody for bringing us out here and giving me an opportunity to hang out with friends and old friends and new friends alike, and do this together. This is actually, Aubree and I have known each other for, what, 2 years now? Something like that, since the beginning of the pandemic. Have been podcasting together across both of our shows, and have not gotten to meet in person until today. So this is a really fun opportunity for both of us. But yeah, we just have like a really brief little kind of some fun little points of LGBTQ history centered around Texas and specifically centered around Houston that we wanted to kind of highlight. If y'all aren't familiar with it, go to the next slide, Brian. So just a little bit about us. So as was mentioned, I'm Leigh Pfeffer. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the host and producer of History is Gay podcast.
I'm Aubree. I'm a writer and podcaster. My show is called Southern Queeries, and we look at everyday life, LGBTQ life in the South.
You can go to the next one. And if you're not familiar with our shows, History is Gay is monthly-ish, if life doesn't get in the way, podcast. Usually it's two queer nerds, myself and either my former co-host or guest hosts like Aubree here. And we've got a passion for social justice, history, and storytelling. We like to say that we examine the overlooked and underappreciated queer ladies, gents, and gentle envies that have always been there in the unexplored corners of history, because history has never been as straight as you think. You'll see some things, in our presentation here, but we really like focusing on where in the pockets of history can we find the queerness that we've never been formally taught about in schools. Next one.
So my show is Southern Queries, and we try to be bi-monthly in terms of getting out episodes. I think the difficulty is we are a two-person team with families and lives and things. And our show is really based on the idea that LGBTQ plus people live here in the South. And so much of the media coverage and so much of the conversation is coastal, whether it's East Coast, West Coast, or if you go to north of Chicago. But people don't understand that the South has the largest concentration of queer people in all of America. We get very little attention. So our show is just trying to bring some of that to life. The good, the bad, the fun, the challenges, the hidden corners of things that you may not know. And so that's what we're trying to do. My co-host is India Bastian, and we just have a good time with it.
Yeah. All right, so the next one. I figured we'd kind of start here with a little bit of early history, because this is kind of my jam. How many people here in Houston are familiar with an early nightclub called Wagon Wheel nightclub? Anybody heard of them? It was really fun. Yes. 1930s. It was around for about 3 years. 1936, 1939. It opened up. It was. Basically in the 1930s, 1920s, early 19th century, you had cross-gender performance was really, really popular on stage, kind of all throughout the United States. You know, while queer folks couldn't necessarily express themselves in like, you know, gender bending ways without reproach in everyday interactions, gender play on stage was really popular and really sought after at this time. And so this was one such club in Houston, and it had a troupe of female impersonators is kind of the language that was used. So you would see Dave or Daisy Gold and his female impersonators of distinction, or you sometimes hear them referred to as the Gay Boy Review. There are wonderful newspaper articles from the time that have statements like, and when she pulled off her wig at the end of the act and revealed herself as a boy, the applause shook the house. So there's really, really fun stuff there. They were very, very popular. There's also the Torch K9 Club in Fort Worth Pike. You've got, you know, reviews in like a Dallas City newspaper saying things like, it's a rendezvous for the local buttercups these nights. So people were really excited about it. You can go to the next one. So here's an image here. This, you know, frequent stars, Dave or Daisy Gold, Murray Pickford, Mickey Dell, Dot Williams, and they would go throughout Texas, throughout the United States for shows and like various gigs. And there were, you know, basically there were penal codes kind of all over that forbid vagrancy and a lot of, you know, interactions with police officers, potential entrapment, prevented a lot of these performers from like settling down in one spot. So they would move around a lot. But yeah, there was, if you go to the next one here. So, you know, while they were really popular on stage, you know, people came under fire at times. So there's actually an article in San Antonio Light from 1933 that, you know, kind of talks about how conditional this kind of, you know, performance and acceptance of these performances could be. You know, people may momentarily laugh at these female impersonators, but men are disgusted to a man dolled up in woman's dress. On the other hand, men may laugh and applaud a male impersonator's stage performance, but a woman resents seeing a woman dressed like a man. So there's some tension there. And there was actually in May 1938, it actually came under fire. A grand jury was brought in to decide the fate of the show under the law. And then in 1938, the club was actually burned in what was believed to be an act of arson. So, you know, there's kind of tensions there between, you know, where do we find kind of gender play and queerness on stage as something to be commodified and accepted and, you know, and enjoyed by people, but where does that kind of cross the line into kind of everyday life?
So centering in a little bit on Houston Pride, from what we can tell, the first Houston Pride March was June 20th, 1976. And this was put on by the University of Houston's Gay Activist Alliance. And they organized a small pride event to commemorate the Stonewall riots. And what I find particularly interesting about this is that there are conflicting reports about possible earlier pride events. I read one that said maybe that there was a small gathering in 1971. I read one that said there was a gathering in 1975. But the difficulty we see with these, as far as trying to pinpoint when was the first of something, is that it really depends on what you call it. Is it a pride march, or a parade, or a protest, or a riot? How you define something really does shift how the coverage is, and the fact that a lot of newspapers were intentionally not giving coverage to these events. So what we have in our history, especially here in Texas, is that there is so much pride history that we don't know because the newspapers intentionally didn't cover it. So when we say that the first Houston Pride March was June 20th, 1976, that's got to have a caveat to it. We do know that this particular one started with around a crowd of about 60 people, and they gathered in a parking lot of the gay bar, the Exile, and marched down Main Street. And during this, the numbers just swelled as people would gather and join this. The low estimates were that it was about 400 people or so. And then after this, there was talk of doing one in 1977, but the money wasn't there. But we know that something happened in 1977 that kind of changed things, so.
And a lot of these images too, we wanted to say, we'll highlight them at the end, but there's a really wonderful website, HoustonLGBThistory.org. So we will
So many
have
sites.
so much wonderful resources. So we just wanted to give credit to, we've borrowed these images, we borrowed some of our, we get a lot of our research from them. So we wanted to really pay homage to, local legend, J.D. Doyle, right? Yeah, so.
And coming from Fort Worth, I wish that our Fort Worth history was well documented as your Houston history is, because the treasure trove of information is so amazing. And our presentation is so brief, we just have to leave something.
Right, yeah, we're like, oh man.
Unfortunate for us.
So yeah.
So that's what I was saying. They weren't going to do a Pride March in 1977 because the funds weren't there. But 1977 was also the time when Anita Bryant was coming to Texas to speak at the Texas Lawyers Association, the Texas Bar Association's annual event as a part of our Save Our Children movement that she started in Miami-Dade, Florida. Part of this whole myth that gay people didn't deserve equal treatment and deserved to be fired from teaching because there's this myth of gay and lesbian people being groomers and pedophiles, and there was this whole backlash against Anita Bryant, and they organized like an organic protest formed against her. And if you think about it, that's probably the best homage to Stonewall that you can get. Not so organized, not as maybe clean and corporate, but more spontaneous and raw. And there's just something about that we just have to acknowledge. There was this quote, members of the crowd wore black armbands with pink triangles. This was a peaceful march that marched from the Hyatt Hotel to the Houston Public Library. The then publisher, the advocate David B. Goodstein, actress Liz Torres, and founder of the Metropolitan Community Church, Reverend Troy Perry, addressed the crowd. By the time the crowd reached the library, numbers had grown to between 8,000 to 10,000 protesters.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it turned into a candlelight vigil as well.
She stayed, so inside the hotel, of course, Anita Bryant's protest performance received a standing ovation. Because, say what you want about her, she can't sing. She's just a terrible person. No.
So you can actually see there's an image of Houston police in riot gear at the Houston Public Library, kind of responding to this mass rally. There was a minister who was at the Pride Parade in 1978, who really kind of reflected on what Anita Bryant did for the gay community, specifically Houston's gay community. He said, it took Anita Bryant to bring this many of our brothers and sisters out of their closets. And Ray Hill, who's a gay activist, said, Houston's gay and lesbian community actually became a community. Before Anita, gay community meant where the bars were. After Anita, gay community meant people. So there's a big shift there in, starting to organize and starting to realize our collective value and our collective power. And, we're going to go and we're going to bring the fight to wherever it's migrating to.
Next one.
So, post 1977, we have this kind of fervor of protesting and, gathering together and this new sense of community. So that leads to Town Meeting 1, which is Houston's first formal Gay Pride Week celebration. And it was basically, political caucus that kind of came together. Thousands gathered to have dialogue and organize. State Representative Frances Charlton Sissy Farenthold. Actually, you can see her in the picture on the right speaking. at the event, where she has a quote. She said, "We are none of us free until we all are free. We cannot open the door to some minorities while denying access to others." And so this was a week-long celebration and organizing a whole bunch of different meetings, and it actually resulted in a lot of Houston LGBTQ staples that you still have around today. Some of them are Montrose Counseling Center, Montrose Activity Center, Gay and Lesbian Switchboard, the Hispanic Caucus, and the Montrose Sports Association. So this was a really significant kind of gathering of minds and organizing to kind of build like the building blocks of what would become, you know, Houston's like really vibrant LGBTQ community. Go next.
So shifting away from pride parades, if you will, because after starting in the 1980s, that they did tend to be more of a regular thing and become more established. We did have a tragedy that occurred in 1991. How many of you all knew the name of Paul Broussard? Wow, a lot of you. But I'm seeing that there's a generational shift for maybe some of the younger people maybe don't know the name. So Paul Broussard was a banker. He was 27 years old. After a night out with his friends in the Montrose area, they were actually brutally attacked by 10 people. That they jumped them, that they attacked them, that they beat them, they stabbed them. 2 people ended up going to the hospital. 1 person got away. Broussard unfortunately passed away from this brutal attack. And the thing that kind of rallied the Houston community was just the seeming indifference that the police had, that the politicians had. It was a hate crime that happened in Montrose, supposedly supposed to be a safe space, and there was no one that cared in a position of authority. And it's sad that it's oftentimes these kind of tragedies that lead us to have some kind of level of united community. And eventually, the attackers did go to jail, from sentences ranging to probation to 24 years, 45 years. The person who served the longest, 24 years, got paroled in 2015. But this is one of the few times when you actually do have a level of accountability, because we know that the sad part is the Broussard murder is the anomaly. Most hate crimes against our community go unprosecuted, there's no conviction, or there's a small amount of investigation that never leads to an arrest. So this is a tragedy, but it's also the anomaly that there was a level of justice, but it brought the community together in a good reminder that it's more than just marches, it's more than just having to be there for each other for AIDS activism. We have to be there to keep each other safe at all times, and we have to force the city to care about our issues and care about our safety. So this was a pretty seminal moment. I had not heard about this until a few years ago when I started researching, and it's amazing that unless you were around in the early 90s or the late 90s, you may not have known about this event. So, right. Next one.
Next one. So this is pretty topical, I think. So many of you may be familiar with Lawrence v. Texas, a Supreme Court case from 2003. So Texas had a law from 1973 prohibiting what it termed deviant sexual conduct in between individuals of the same sex. It also, kind of ascribed to, all things considering sodomy law, which was basically anything that is, intimate relations outside of getting together in order to make a baby, and these specific instances. And in 1998, 2 men, John Lawrence and Tyron Garner, were arrested after police were responding to a call of, quote, a black male going crazy with a gun. And they then arrived at Lawrence's apartment and caught the men engaging in sexual contact. And the prevailing theory is that the 911 call was actually something that was kind of set up for them. It was placed by a spurned lover of Lawrence, trying to basically, get revenge. The man who placed the call, someone named Mr. Eubanks, was convicted of filing a false report. And the sheriff who was there, wasn't initially sure what to charge them with. Deputies gave conflicting stories. basically Lambda Legal, a really wonderful organization, convinced Lawrence and Garner to plead no contest. So historically, it's if you got caught on an entrapment charge or a sodomy charge, a lot of times in the community, it was, all right, I'm gonna plead guilty and I'm just gonna try to let this go away. Try to bury it, and try to continue on with my life. And this goes back to things like the Lavender Scare in the 1950s, which was a moral panic where thousands upon thousands of queer people were being fired from military and governmental jobs because they thought that they were a national security risk. So defense attorneys actually had to convince the sentencing judge to raise their fine to $125 so that the case would actually qualify for appeal. And then in 2003, the Supreme Court took up the case and said, and ruled that the 14th Amendment's due process clause gave a right to privacy to consenting adults. It overturned a case in 1986, Bowers v. Hardwick, which said that gay couples had no fundamental right to privacy in the bedroom. And so as we are, kind of entering, unfortunately, a post-Roe world, that is another decision that kind of rests on the same kind of logic and arguments that Roe v. Wade was not codified, obviously, but was decided under. And so this is something that, once again, is really under fire and under threat right now. There you go.
All right, so just we're gonna go through the next few just kind of real briefly, just kind of real quick because we know it's a discussion.
We're a little
So we're gonna
verbose.
move a little bit quicker. We know that Texas banned same-sex marriage in 2005. And even though the Obergefell decision was passed just a few years ago, Texas never actually took the ban out of the Constitution. So the worry is if the Supreme Court overturns Obergefell, this ban would come back into effect. But the scary part that we have to look at is that this was done by vote, because all constitutional amendments have to be approved by the people in Texas. Only 17% of registered voters voted for this, that showed up for it. Only 17% showed up to even vote on this. And of the numbers that showed up, 1.7 million people, or 76%, voted yes. And 536,000, or 24%, voted no. But if we had just gotten more people to show up that were against it, just that alone could have been enough to defeat it. But 17% is such a small number, but that is still on the books. And the next one real quick.
We just wanted to really quickly highlight, so Anise Parker was Houston's first openly gay mayor. She was elected in 2009 and she served from 2010 to 2016. And at that point in history, Houston was the largest city in America to have an openly gay leader, or an openly LGBTQ leader. She marched in that first Pride event that we talked about. She was actually there in 1976. And this is a lovely picture from the 2010 parade where she is riding through the parade with her wife, Kathy Hubbard. And at this point, Pride was Houston's second biggest parade behind the rodeo parade, which is pretty cool to think about. Okay. Next one. And we just wanted to, there's so much here. There's a whole repertoire of them on Houston LGBT history, but we just wanted to point out some kind of neat historic Texas gay publications. So a lot of early organizing pre-internet came down to magazines and newsletters that would get distributed through the mail. So we have some here, the Albatross, the one on the left. This is what might be Houston's earliest gay publication, started in 1965, and it included things like bar listings, including that one that we mentioned for the Pride Parade, the Exile, and it actually didn't include the word gay at all until 1966, which is interesting. Makes me think a lot of the early homophile movements in the 50s and early 60s, where they would use kind of obscure titles in their organizations because you didn't want to have a target on your back. And so you had things like the Mattachine Society or Daughters of Bilitis with very obscure literary or historical references and did not have gay or lesbian in the titles.
Yeah, things like the Midnight Rider. which did kind of evolve into becoming the Pegasus. You had 69, which started in 1978. The Dallas Voice, which started in 1984. You had Lone Star Lesbians, which we absolutely love.
That was my
And that one only
that's an awesome one.
That was in 1977. We think it lasted maybe 2 issues, maybe a little bit more, but it wasn't long lasting. They had one, Gender Bent, Notes from the Drag King Community, and that was 2008, so that's a more recent one. And then another older one is the Southwest Courier, which only lasted around 3 issues from January and February to 1977.
And that's
So a lot of
that's
these were
in
kind of fly-by-night, or closer maybe to what we would call the zine culture, which is a whole another topic we don't have time to get into. Texas queer zine culture is a whole nother thing we could talk about another day. So great.
We'll go to the next one. So, Regret's Ministry.
Let's look at where we at.
Where are we at now? Do you want to start with this one?
Oh, sure. So we know from a standpoint of politics, because politics and government's kind of my thing, we do know that our representation is getting better. After 2019, there were 5 women that formed the first Texas state legislature's LGBTQ caucus. So we know we have that kind of success going for us. We also know that all large cities in Texas have non-discrimination ordinances preventing people from being discriminated against in employment, housing, jobs, social services. And that is where we're seeing a lot of the progress, is at the local level. At the state level, we still don't have a statewide gender equality or sexual orientation equality law, a law that affirms gender identity. In fact, we seem to be going backwards in some way. The state legislature is actively attacking us for existing, especially LGBTQ plus kids in schools, whether it's dress codes, whether it's what's the books that are in the libraries, and we're going to talk about that. It does feel like the onslaught is now not against adults so much, because they know that adults have better legal representation. We've been in the fight longer. The adults are the attack is for the kids, and that's the scariest part. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the things we're still need to look out for. And 2019 and 2020, Texas led the nation in transgender murders and attacks. 2022, the numbers have been a little bit lower. It's been a little bit quieter. We've had fewer trans murders, or in Texas. It's a Texas presentation.
Right, but that's important
we've
to
had
mention
fewer
is
murders in Texas,
but overall
but
for the United States.
it's only June, so we'll see.
And overall for the United States, it's record numbers, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah, but see, you're from California. We're in Texas. We only care about Texas and Texas, right? No, I'm just kidding.
We can go on the next one there. And this is, some really new stuff. So, you might have been familiar with in October 2021, and the Texas legislature, House Bill 25, HB 25, a law specifically targeting transgender youth, banning trans athletes in schools from competing on teams that are aligned with their own gender identity. So Greg Abbott signed that bill. And there have been attempts both this year and last year to ban gender-affirming healthcare for trans minors in Texas and throughout the whole country. There's been a lot of these bills, a lot of bathroom bills going through. At this point, the ACLU has actually sued Governor Greg Abbott over these actions, so we'll see how that goes. But like Aubree was saying, the newest kind of scapegoats really are the trans community and specifically trans youth. And there's a lot of language that really specifically goes back to exactly the same kind of language and arguments that were brought up in 1977 and 1978 with Anita Bryant. So, that's worth looking into, is that I like to think of it as kind of like bigot whack-a-mole. It's the same thing that just keeps popping up, and you just keep needing to tap it down. And we'll skip the next slide there.
So last thing, just a few resources. We always like to give spots where people can learn more. The Houston LGBThistory.org is a great site to go to. The University of Houston has a great LGBT history research collection.
And on the next next one here, so, we've mentioned that there's a lot of actions that are happening right now against our community. And so for anyone who is looking for ways to lend monetary support or, get down on the ground and fight, to, kind of organizations we wanted to highlight, we have the Montrose Center right here. And we also have the Transgender Education Network of Texas, which is really specifically fighting a lot of these actions that are being targeted at young trans youth as well.
And also the last one I'll recommend is if you want like a more modern take or a more academic look at it, one of the best places you can really turn to is where we're at now, the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. And I wanted to put that because we do a lot of history, but as far as the current context and current understanding of the culture, Rice University is doing a great job with that. So I didn't put that on the slide.
Yeah, and that's what we've got. We've got our next one. So thank you everyone for allowing us to talk at you for a little bit. And we'll see if we can send this out to, anybody who registered through the Eventbrite, because we've got some great links in there. And and now we're gonna learn all about what's happening in terms of the challenges in the literary world, which is so much fun.
Yes. Thank you, Leigh and Aubree. That was a really great presentation. And so I just want to talk a little bit about book censorship and kind of define some of the terms that we see being thrown around, and also highlight some examples and just briefly share what HCPL's collection policy is. So when we think of book censorship, the word that we tend to throw around is book banning, and there's kind of a reason for that. It's simple, it's alliterative, it's easy to throw around, but oftentimes it can kind of take the point too far. Sometimes what we see as book banning is actually book challenges, and so what challenges are, those are what you hear about at school board meetings. Those are the parents that get up and read sections of books completely out of context. Those lead to complaints about, again, those sections that are completely out of context. And so challenges usually lead to books being evaluated. In some cases, those books get to stay on the shelves. In other cases, like in KDISD, last year they took 30 books off their shelves to be evaluated for content. A majority of those were LGBT content, but they also featured people of color as well. And so book challenging can then lead to what is actually book banning. And so books are being actively removed from the shelves and from the curriculum. So, and then in extreme cases, they're actually destroyed. There is Rapid City ISD in Rapid City, South Dakota, actually marked, I believe, 4 or 5 books on their list to be burned. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole book about that.
Yes. Yeah. And then aside from book challenges and book banning, we also have sort of this third category, what's known as sometimes soft censorship or shadow banning. And so the idea of this is that sometimes teachers and librarians, for fear of controversy, will choose not to feature certain books or certain authors. And while sometimes this can be understandable, especially with the rise of doxing, and the internet, where a local challenge suddenly becomes a huge challenge, and so teachers and librarians get hate mail from all over the world. But unfortunately, what that means for authors in particular, so those authors, if they're not featured in the curriculum, they don't get asked to come to book talks. They don't get asked to come meet their community. And so it's not just about, oh, this book is taken off the shelf, so we're not reading it. It can actually jeopardize an author's livelihood. And for queer kids, not being able to see those authors, not being able to see those books because somebody is afraid, it just adds up to, a kid can feel, okay, there's nobody that looks like me in my book or in my classroom or anywhere in the world. Even with the rise of the internet today, it can still happen. Kids can still feel very alone. There's also another form of this soft censorship, and that's creating review policies that slow the addition of titles to libraries and curriculum. See, Roanoke City Schools in Roanoke, Virginia actually enacted a policy where they require 2 to 3 librarians at the elementary school and high school level to read a book and then sign off on the book's content before the book can be added to libraries and then even to the curriculum. And they're not even giving the librarians time to do this during their workday. It's one of those things that they have to do on their own time. And given the amount of books that are published every single year and the amount of collection development that those librarians have to do, it's frankly an impossible task. And so then finally, I just want to wrap up and talk about what our policy is at the library. So Harris County Public Library provides free and open access to information and services without qualification. Given the necessity of including information on a broad range of topics, it is expected that there may be materials in the collection that are regarded as controversial by some members of the community. Customers wishing to comment on materials may complete a reconsideration request. These items remain on the shelves while they are reviewed by the reconsideration committee. And I'm very proud of our collection at Harris County Public Library. Last summer, I helped with a project called the LGBTQ titles cataloging project. And so what we did is we went through our catalog and created a local tag called LGBTQ titles. And so we added that to books that were already tagged as like gay, homosexual, bisexual, transgender. And so that way, if a kid doesn't know what what specific representation they might be looking for, they can just type in LGBTQ titles into our catalog. And I don't remember the exact number, but I know we had like 4,000 titles at one point tagged with that. So you can see we've got a lot of stuff out there. Yeah, and that's all I have, and I'll turn it over to Tesla to start the.
Awesome. Excellent. So again, we're going to do a bit of a kind of conversation with the panel and then open it up for Q&A with all of you. So I think kind of first, as I was like listening to this presentation and especially MC kind of just a moment ago, I was kind of reminded of the title of kind of our panel today, which is Library for All. And I'm wondering about that all and who is encapsulated through that. I think libraries are so often seen as these like neutral repositories of information that everybody gets to go in and they're going to find themselves in that library. And I think what we know about neutrality is that it's often just a signal that something is kind of conforming to a dominant viewpoint. And so I guess for all of you, I'm wondering kind of how do you think we can create welcoming libraries and collections, and also maybe disrupt this idea of neutrality and highlight more about kind of what MC is saying, where these collections are growing and changing and shifting, and they're not static and they're not neutral.
Wow. I would just say, because I mean, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot this month. How do I make my library space welcoming and signal to everybody that yes, you are welcome here? And so, I mean, a big part of that, I put on my own shoulders, like I wear a lot of rainbow items year round, but I definitely up it a lot during June. I have buttons on my lanyard that state, I'm a member of the community, I'm here for you, but we also have signs up in our library that just say, this library is a safe space. This library system is celebrating Pride. I've had a display up in the front for all months, just so when people walk right in, they see it, it's here for you. But at the same time, I still struggle, like, how do I do that year round? How do I make sure that it's not just June?
Yeah.
I think what you said about there is no such thing as like neutrality. The concept of neutrality is something that exists as a position of like inaction or absence. And that, unfortunately, to communities that are kind of dominating a conversation or dominating kind of societal systems, take that kind of abstinence of public opinion as tacit acceptance of it. And so you have to make a really strong statement. You have to be able to say, no, these are the values that we're standing for, and we're going to go and do X, Y, and Z to make sure that people know that they are welcome. And there may be people who don't like that, and they can self-select themselves out of there. But you have to, you have to make it explicit. And it's hard when those things are legally challenged as well. And so, I think like the queer community, I think communities of color have always kind of existed in trying to find that coding and subtextual things as well. Like sometimes, it's, you may not be able to put, depending on what kind of, legislation is happening, you may not be able to put a sign in the window that says, hey, we're a safe space, come in here. But you may be able to keep those books on the shelf in a section, or you may be able to wear a pair of rainbow glasses, and then when a teen comes up to you at the, at the library, they have these kind of moments. I think when we talked on the Using Our Librarian Voices podcast, we talked about like the Ring of Keys moment.
Yes.
If any of you have ever seen the musical Fun Home, just this moment of like finding these pieces that you can kind of recognize in other people as symbols of solidarity and community. And I think that's also something that the queer community is really has really traded in for a long time. If you look into the way that people were kind of communicating in the 1970s, you have things like the hanky code. There's like rumors about like, which earring is the gay earring? All these kind of subtextual systems, symbols and ways that we kind of communicate. So, be overt when you can, but there are also kind of, undergrounds that you can.
I was just gonna say, you brought up Fun Home, and I think one of the very salient pieces of some of these book challenges and book bans have been kind of unequivocally on graphic novels in particular.
Yes.
And I think Maya Kobabe's Genderqueer, a graphic memoir, which I think has been the most challenged book this year, is one really good example.
Sure.
Really, a really wonderful graphic novel. But one of the things Maya has said about kind of why this book, why right now in this moment, I think one of the things is the internet. And so when people were looking for books in their own local libraries, it was there because it had won a bunch of awards, including a Lambda Literary Award. And so since your book was kind of in the local libraries, it became this oh my goodness, this book has infiltrated our tiny community. And so then that kind of snowballed and spiraled. So it was both, you could tell that there was kind of a pornographic element because people look at pictures and they say, oh, that has a very special link to kind of porn and sexual explicitness. And so you can take these images out of context. And two, because libraries were collecting based on all of these wonderful awards, books were on the shelves. And so when a lot of people went to go kind of find books, this was a book that was kind of particularly there, and that's part of the reason. And so it's not necessarily, so in that moment, it's not necessarily the content of this one book. It is kind of this book standing in for a whole series of books and for an ideology that's kind of sweeping through. So I guess my next thought, and also feel free to ask questions of each other, is why do you think all of these kind of challenges and censorships, they've been really ramping up in the last few years, why now? Is there anything you can kind of attribute it to? What about this backlash? And maybe how do we think this is going to we think that this might change kind of collection practices going forward?
We just kind of talked about this, yeah.
Change is hard for some people and for some cultures and for some segments of the population. You've grown up thinking one way about relationships, about sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, And in the last 20 years, since the 20th century ended, things have moved very quickly. I mean, 2003, Lawrence v. Texas is overturned. We got rid of DOMA. We got the Windsor case. We legalized same-sex marriage. We provided job protections for people with the Bostock decision. Culturally speaking, things are moving very, very quickly, largely because of the internet. We have more access to more information, and that can scare people. You feel like your way of life, what you know to be true, is being challenged, and you want to dig your heels in because this is what I can hold on to. This helps me make sense of the world. And if now I find myself on the minority, I find myself on the outside where I'm being told the things I think are right are no longer right. Do I just give in? Do I just acquiesce and change? Or do I have that cognitive dissonance? Do I just fight for it? And we're seeing a lot of that where the culture's moving so fast, it is provoking a lot of fights. And a lot of this culture war is created not by the regular people. It's created by politicians that want to stay in office. And LGBTQ plus people have always been an easy punching bag. We're easy to fundraise on, we're easy to rally around, like, oh, those people are not like you, give me $5,000, I'll go to the Senate and I'll protect you from them. We are easy to fundraise against. And they're playing into that cultural fear. Things move so quickly, we're more multicultural. Kids today are more accepting than ever before. Every generation is more accepting and more diverse than the last generation. That can create some fear. And I understand that. The question is really, how do you counteract that in a way that doesn't cause people to dig in their heels further? I mean, to answer your last question, what we should do for libraries, every library should have their budget doubled. I mean, I think that's number one. I've never been to a library that wasn't underfunded, and I've been to some amazing libraries. I'm a library stan, I love them. I find them all to be underfunded. Let's double everyone, and that way librarians can have more choice. Because frequently, the difficulty we have is we're making a choice with the limited budget. So what gets bought, whenever you buy one book, that's one book that doesn't get bought from a different category. So we gotta double the budgets to allow us just to buy more books in general.
For sure.
And they give me the books.
Yeah.
I won't return them though.
Yeah, we talked about the rise of the internet, especially in these conversations on the podcast, which the podcast released last Friday. It's using Library Voices. It's on Spotify and all the different podcast mediums.
Wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for having me.
We talked about the rise of the internet and how it's been both good and bad for these conversations. Good because, like people are recommending books to each other. People are able to support each other, but also bad because, again, like school board conversations that would, 10 years ago stay in that community are just getting spread over everywhere online. And the reaction to that, good and bad, as people are talking about it.
Well, and we keep bringing up the word reaction, right?
Yeah.
This is absolutely reactionary. I think it's really important, like how do we combat that, right? How do we fight this? I think, not to harp on like what I do constantly for, my job, but we have to look at our history. I don't think that it is a coincidence that all of these things are happening right now. 2020, 2021, we had the most amount of LGBTQ representatives in government than we've ever had in this country. And like Aubree was saying, people are scared. People are really terrified that their hold on society is faltering. And when that happens, there's kind of a rush to, really go strong in the other direction, which is why it kind of feels like we're going backwards. But, I want to also encourage folks that it's really, really discouraging and it's really awful to hear this. It's like, oh my God, we're going back 50 years. What is going on? This is not the first time that we've been here. When we mentioned Anita Bryant and Save Our Children, that was specifically a response to that just didn't come out of, nowhere. It was specifically a set of responses to the fact that many, I think it was something like, 60 different cities and municipalities around the country had started putting in anti-discrimination ordinances against discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing, in employment, and in public accommodations. And so it was at this point where it was like, oh, gay and queer people are going to start becoming kind of more parts of our lives. And that is when you saw all of these kind of really, kind of radical groups come up and, establish like, this is what we need to go back to. And, they're using the same language. Like we've seen these arguments before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I post a lot of LGBTQ content on the Katie Branch Library Facebook page. I'm constantly like recommending LGBTQ books or posting about events. And, I have to delete comments like just about every other day that's like, why are you showing this to our children? I hope that you go out of business because you're warping our children. And it's like, yeah, it's really keeps coming back to the same argument. Save our children. And it's like, I was a kid too. We were all kids in this room.
We are your children.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's I think it's really important to go, fight at your local level, right? Is the more people we have actually, in office, in organizations that are legally fighting these battles, the tide is turning, even though it really feels like, we keep kind of backsliding. And I know that can be exhausting, right? It's like, God, we've done this already, what are we doing? But, you look at the holistic picture of what we have. And it's, we got some books behind us that like, when I was a kid, and I grew up in the, in the 90s, like I didn't have all this stuff. And so the fact that I can now go into a bookstore or a library and have a plethora of, options to kind of see, myself or at least, close to myself, representing is kind of unthinkable for me. And I'm sure, I'm, into the millennial, cusp, but like, folks who may be older, like have an even different kind of perspective on that of, what you could have.
I don't like how you said people that are older and you looked at me.
No, I was looking around the room.
God,
You were like,
yes.
like the same.
I think probably this brings me to my last question before we open it up, and you segued kind of nicely into one of them. So are there any like stories or characters in recent LGBTQ books that kind of give you joy or hope or like materialize a way of being that you like were missing and you never knew that you were missing? This is really, and like for you each kind of personally, and then you can also think about it and we can return to that.
In a book, in books.
Or
Any media,
recent
I feel like
media.
any media.
I have a book, Tori Peters' Detransition Baby. I just loved it. I mean, there aren't that many books about trans characters as adults. There's some trans YA and middle grade, but trans fiction for adults isn't a lot that's there, let alone that isn't about coming out. It's about wanting to have a family, wanting to have a kind of journey that it's a little bit more in depth. I don't get a lot of that. As for real people, I would say I've been learning more and more about Holly Murray, and I just love them so much. Their kind of activism is the kind of activism I want to do. Writing, using their legal mind, their intellect, more so than marching. And so I found Holly Murray to be very inspirational.
It's funny that you mentioned genderqueer because that really was a really seminal book for me in the last couple of years. And I, I'm lucky enough to have gotten to meet Maya a couple of times. And being able to read such a similar experience to my own, kind of coming to my own sense of gender and the ways that that interacted with my history in fandom, and also, you know, some of my kind of experiences with my own sexuality or asexuality too. I kind of, you know, I went up to Maya at a book reading and was like, hi, when did you get in here? You know, and it's to see that kind of represented in a graphic memoir, which I've been heavily involved in like the comics and graphic novel community for a very long time. And so that was really special to me. Really recently, actually, I have a friend who's another illustrator. Their name is Rhea Ewing, and they just published their own book called Fawny, a comic about gender, where they spent the last 10 years doing interviews with people all over the Midwest, which is they are from, or they just recently moved from Wisconsin, about gender and what it means to them, cis and trans people alike. And it's really gorgeously done. It's like half memoir, half kind of, you know, cultural anthropology about gender, and it's really beautifully done. So I think those are some of my recent favorites.
So I would have to say probably one of the first books that I read with an LGBTQ storyline that I didn't like actively go on the internet and Google obsessively to find one. I just was able to walk into a bookstore and it was there on the shelf. And I was like, I had never heard about this until it was on the bookstore, and now I can pick it up and read it. And so Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albatali, which came out in 2015, it's a YA book about the main character writes writes emails to a pen pal who he doesn't know the identity of. And it's just like a look over the school year at him writing emails back and forth, and also like the narrative just about discovering his own gay identity, having this burgeoning relationship with the guy that he's emailing, and how it eventually all comes out and how he deals with it. And I mean, when I first picked it up in 2015, I was like, again, I'd never seen this before. And now in 2022, we have like so much queer YA across so many different identities that a lot of people think, you know, oh, Simon Versus is kind of basic, you know, like they made a movie out of it. It's just, you know, it's like LGBTQ books for straight people. But yeah, it was one of the first books that I read that just like sat in my heart, and it's still there. But more recently, I've been obsessed with Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, which is sitting behind us.
Yeah.
And I actually got to, when Harris County was at the Pride Festival and the parade this past weekend, I wore it in a parade. And so that's made me really happy to be able to represent that book. But so Last Night at the Telegraph Club is set in 1950 San Francisco. And so the main character is an Asian American teenage girl who goes out to the Telegraph Club one night, and the Telegraph Club has male impersonators, and so she gets into this community, and she discovers her identity. It's a coming of age book, and part of the reason that I love it so much is that queer historical aspect. Like, I like to think that I know a lot about queer history, but until I read Last Night at the Telegraph Club, I didn't know anything about the 50s. I didn't know about about cross-gender performance like Leigh talked about. And so just being able to read that and see that in 2021 and know that teens get to pick up books like that now that talk about queer history, that means a lot to me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for indulging me in all of your like kind of favorite attached books.
Yes.
So yeah, does anyone from our audience here or virtual have any questions for Phil?
Who wants to break the ice?
Houston, we're not used to ice.
What?
It says Houston, we're not used to ice.
True.
This is nice.
I've got kind of a weird question. I noticed the wagon wheel was not in the city, but was off sort of in a rural area. Is that just coincidence or was that by design?
You know, I'm not certain.
Frequently.
New York and
Go ahead.
Yes, what?
Panelist Tish.
Hi, so the wagon wheel was outside of the city limits because the city of Houston had a cross-dressing ordinance
Oh,
dated to
there
the
you go.
Civil War,
Yes.
and you could be arrested for appearing in clothing not appropriate to the sex you were assigned at birth.
Yeah, you'll find that there are a lot of clubs that you go back, the clubs and the owners were very aware of the exact city boundaries and city lines for where something is or isn't allowed. I'm gonna date myself, but there's this old episode of this TV show Maude, where that was the exact part of the plot, was the gay bar was on the opposite of the city line, so it was legal. So you have to know the boundaries, you have to know, queer people have to know the law very well, just to survive in early days.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of like anti-cross-dressing laws, I mean, you'll find those kind of all over the country, probably up until about like the 70s. A lot of times, they had like a very specific number of items of clothing that you could technically get away with that were like opposite gender allowed before, it was, you would be booked and taken into jail. One of my favorite, kind of stories around that is, in the 1960s in San Francisco, there's, so how many folks know the name Harvey Milk, right? How many of you know the name Jose Sarria? So Harvey Milk was the first openly gay person to be elected to office in the United States. Jose Sarria was the first openly gay person to run for office. He was a Colombian American. He was a Spanish Colombian American who was living in San Francisco, and he was a drag queen. He was one of the founders of Society for Individual Rights, which was one of the homophile organizations in the 1960s. And he actually ran for the same seat that Harvey Milk won. He ran for San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1961. So Harvey Milk was elected in 1978. He did that in 1961, and he was a drag queen. He used to perform at kind of a bohemian queer arts cafe called the Black Cat in San Francisco, and he used to put on these like full-length opera parodies in drag. And one of my favorite things from the Black Cat Cafe is, so you had all of these waiters in drag, but you had this anti-cross-dressing law, right? And so frequently this cafe would be raided by the police. And if you were caught wearing women's clothes, you would be arrested. So all of these waiters in this Black Cat Cafe, along with their outfits, had a black cat pinned to the front of their outfit. It just said, "I'm a boy." And that is my item of clothing that corresponds with my assigned sex at birth. And so, I think, you look into those kind of things, and the ways that we kind of figure out the lines in between is really fascinating. Tangent.
I'm curious to know, I'm a new parent, and I'm wondering if, besides using literature to teach my child about gay history, are there any curriculums or websites that you recommend to parents to teach their children?
Oh, I guess I'm the only parent.
You're there, but
I am the
also
parent.
I have
Yes, I have a 12-year-old, yes. Off the top of my head, there are quite a few books out there about Stonewall for kids, LGBTQ, history for kids. The names of them are escaping me. I can get them to you afterwards. I don't remember them offhand, but I know that actually we're seeing more and more research and curriculum that's age appropriate show up. And I also homeschool, so I'm obsessed with curriculum. My wife and I are obsessed with every single thing our daughter learns, because of course we are. And there's a lot more now, some of that can actually be overwhelming. And we're actually starting to see it looks to be more diverse in terms of culture as well. And that's also a good sign. But Specific titles, I can get to you at the end.
Thank you.
In terms of like curricula and, ways to kind of help like develop, kind of lessons or, kind of themed things that you want, there are a couple of organizations that are doing some really good work. There is, centered in, like in New England area, Northeast, there is an organization called History Unerased, and they put together, like packets, like lesson plan packets of various pieces of LGBTQ history for different grade levels. And there's, where I'm from in California, in the Bay Area, there's actually, we do have a piece of legislation that was passed in 2011 called the FAIR Act. It's Fair, Accurate, Inclusive Representation, Fair, Accurate, Inclusive Representation in Education Act. And only now are we starting to actually see implementation strategies to like get that information in into textbooks, into curriculum. But there's a website that's teaching LGBTQ history. I think it's .org. It's either .org or .com. I'm not 100% sure, but we can send that out with the resources that we have. But they have different curricula for different grade levels. Granted, it is based on the the social studies standards framework of California, but it's really, it's going to be kind of, it's going to be really kind of cross-useful. And an organization in the Bay Area, Our Family Coalition, is specifically a nonprofit that connects queer families to resources and advocacy and education. So I check them out.
Thank you.
All right, well, do you have one from the audience? No. Oh, we'll just say, do we? Okay. Excellent, that's what I was just gonna do too. So thank you so much to our panelists and the library and the center. Also, if you wanna stay up to date with the Center for the Study of Sexuality, of Women's Gender and Sexuality, there's a sign-up sheet right on the podium, kind of behind me here. So if you want to be on that events and information blast, please sign up. But otherwise, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our panelists. This is a really great conversation.
Thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thanks to our panel. I learned a lot tonight. I hope you did too. Please visit both organizations' websites, hcpl.net, to learn more. And I believe it's CSWGS.rice.edu. We have some surveys. It'd mean a lot to us if you would take the time to fill them out so we can learn more about what kind of programs you'd like to see and how you felt about tonight's program. If you didn't get one at the end, I have some here. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.